gone to the polls and they've voted for the next president. But did they really vote for the president? Let's take a look at what our founders set up for us in the Electoral College and what the Electoral College is and what does it mean. First of all, think about the system that the Founding Fathers were in back when America got started. They had just become an independent nation of 13 separate colonies, and they wanted to create a system that would represent not only the population in the government, but statehood as well. When they had the House of Representatives and the Senate, they did so by allowing the Senate to be represented by the states, every state having 2 senators, and the House of Representatives based on population. So states with more people would have more representatives than states with smaller populations. But in the Senate, they would be equal. Now, when they created the office of the presidency, they also had to find a way to compromise on how the president would be selected. One of the first ideas was to have the president selected by Congress, to let Congress choose the president. The problem they had with that would be that the executive branch wouldn't have the separation of powers that they were seeking to have for the presidency. So they threw that idea out. The smaller states wanted it to be selected 1 vote per state. But the larger states with more population didn't think that that was a fair way to select the president and would give them less representation for the number of people they had. They wanted the president selected by popular vote. And of course, the smaller states didn't support that plan. So what they created was the Electoral College. Now, there's a couple of advantages to the Electoral College besides just balancing statehood issues and population issues. The ability of presidential candidates to make it to all 13 colonies up and down the eastern seaboard. They never envisioned how transportation would change and how communication would change. So they came up with a system where you would actually select electors, or people who were familiar with the candidates that were running, and you would vote for that elector who would then cast a vote for president. Now, the system has been in place since the beginning with a couple of tweaks as far as selection of the vice president and some things like that. But for the most part, the Electoral College still holds true today what the Founding Fathers wanted to accomplish when they started. And think about it. These are the things they wanted to do. 1, they wanted the executive branch to be independent of the legislative and judicial branch. The Electoral College accomplished that. 2, they wanted the president to be chosen with a balance of statehood and population. The Electoral College accomplished that. And 3, they knew that it would be difficult for presidential candidates to make it to every state, but the electors would be familiar with the candidates, and you would select an elector who would then cast a vote for president. And they accomplished that. Now today there are 538 electoral votes. So how do we get to that number? Well, let's take a look at it. There are 435 members of the House of Representatives, divided by population. And there are 100 senators, 2 per state. That only adds up to 535. Well, the Founding Fathers put in place for the District of Columbia to have 3 electoral votes. And that's how we get to 538. Now, with the 538, another component that the Founding Fathers put in that made sure that the president would have a large wave of support was that the candidates had to have a majority of the Electoral College. Since we have 538 electoral votes, that means exactly half is 269. So to win, you need 270. This was important to the Founding Fathers to make sure that whoever was selected president had a majority of the Electoral College. Now, if you look at that number, is it possible to tie in the Electoral College? And the answer is yes. With 538, you could have 269 to 269. Now, the Founding Fathers weren't thinking about just a two-candidate race. As a matter of fact, they really wanted there to be many candidates for president. But we developed a two-party system. And because of the two-party system, you could split the Electoral College even into two candidates. But they also took into account, should there be a tie in the Electoral College, there's a way to break the tie. And here's what they came up with. They wanted the House of Representatives to select the president in case of a tie, or in case that one candidate did not achieve a majority of the electoral votes. Now, how the House does that is a little bit different. There's 435 members of the House, but they don't all get to vote. They get to choose one vote for their state. So let's look at California. They have 53 representatives in Congress. But if there was a tie in the Electoral College, California gets one vote. When you look at a state like Wyoming, that only has 568,000 people, Wyoming gets one vote. Ironically, Wyoming has one representative. So, in selecting the president, they even had a tiebreaker system that takes into account, one, population, and two, statehood. Now, the vice president is selected by the Senate, and in the Senate, it's 100 votes. So each senator gets an independent vote. When the votes are added up in the House, the person with the most votes would win the presidency, and the same thing in the Senate. The person with the most votes would get the vice presidency. So what possibilities are there? Well, currently, the House is controlled by Republicans. So it's very conceivable that if there should be a tie, that Mitt Romney would become president. However, the Senate is controlled by the Democratic Party. So it would very much be likely that the Democrats could select Joe Biden as vice president in the case of a tie. And in that case, you would have a Romney-Biden administration. Now, which Congress gets to select the new president and vice president in the case of a tie? According to the way that the Constitution reads, and according to 270towin.com, it would be the newly elected Congress that would vote and select the president and vice president. So, when you look back at what the Founding Fathers put together, when these men met in Philadelphia and developed the new system of government that we work under, and they had to come up with compromises that satisfied large states and small states, regional issues to create a nation, they came up with two very, very good compromises. The compromise that created the House and the Senate and the Electoral College. Now, if we look at the Electoral College and we think about, did it really help? Does it really matter today? Well, let's look at the race that we're in right now. We're down to a handful of states called battleground states that could determine the presidency. And in those states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, these might be considered larger states. Florida, they have more electoral votes available. But who else is on that short list? New Hampshire with 4 electoral votes. Iowa with 6. Nevada with 6. Colorado with 9. You have a mix of large states and small states that are still having a heavy hand in deciding who's a president for the next 4 years. So, did the Founding Fathers get it right? Did they create a system that still keeps into balance the small states and the large states, that takes into account population and statehood, that keeps the president independent of the House and the Senate and the Supreme Court by making them directly accountable to the states and to the people? And it would appear that they did. Now, some people say, why don't we just switch over and vote for the president based on popular vote? Well, for one, the small states wouldn't go for that. Take Wyoming, for example. Wyoming has 568,000 people, but in America there's 311 million people. Wyoming's population makes up 0.18% of the nation's population. But in the Electoral College, they have 0.56%, or almost 4 times what their population allows, influence in the Electoral College. Let's look at Kansas. Kansas has 2.8 million people. That makes up 0.92% of the nation's population. But in the Electoral College, we have 1.12% of the total electoral votes there. So we have more influence in the Electoral College based on that system than we would have if we did it based on population alone. Now, the break-even point is 9 electors. So states with 9 electors or less have about the same or more influence, and states with 10 electors or more have about the same or less influence. There are 29 states with 9 or less electoral votes. So to try to change the system, you would have to convince 29 of the 50 states to give up some power in selecting the president. And that seems highly unlikely. So it seems like the founding fathers got it right. They created a system that allows for population, statehood to decide who will be the next president of the United States. And they allowed for, if there is a tie, it would go to the House of Representatives, which is a collection of all the people or the population, but they only get 1 vote per state. It'd be fun to see if that happens. Thanks for joining us here tonight, and let's go back to see what the results are going to be.